Our ancestors created order out of chaos, form out of formlessness, life out of lifelessness. And as they did so, they established the ways in which all things should live in interconnectedness so as to maintain order and sustainability. So this is Aboriginal philosophy. And they're the words of this beautiful woman who's standing behind me. You recognise those words, Vicky?
Yeah, I did.
So Vicky wrote a book called Aboriginal Spirituality, Aboriginal Philosophy. And it's a baseline of Aboriginal thinking in Australia. And it grounds a lot of what we've been talking about in the last couple of days. Because we've been throwing this word around, Aboriginal philosophy, but what actually is it? What does it mean? Where are the words? And so you can go directly to her book and read parts of that. I'll read some more out. Life as we know it goes on. We have survived the white man's world, and you know you can't change that. That to me sounds a bit like a song as well. I met Vicky 10 years ago. We actually disagree on this, but I'm not going to fight with the historian. I actually think we met later on, but she's saying, no, I met you earlier. But I say to her, show me the evidence. She hasn't been able to come up with the evidence yet. I'm just going to go back to some of the things that we touched on in our welcoming, our convener's welcome on day one. So Vicky said, in Australia we have cultural leaders across the country involved in the defence of country who are increasingly having to defend their ancestral lands from those encroachments. These also include developments such as nuclear waste dumps and wholesale theft of water from river systems. And we are thrilled to welcome a representative group of Aboriginal defenders of country to this event. This builds on the first chapter, which was a symposium at the University of Sydney in 2015. And Vicky and I have been talking about doing this chapter 2 for a long time, this event. And so one of the things we wanted to do was bring these cultural leaders here to Melbourne to be able to position their voices at the centre of this chaotic period we're experiencing at the moment, this time of chaos, place of chaos, as we're moving into this crazy debate around climate change. No, there are deniers and then there are those that don't deny. And yet it seems to me that there is only one answer to how we deal with this problem. Why do we have this conference? The words of Aboriginal intellectuals and cultural leaders are not often heard within the Academy in any meaningful way. Vicky's voice again. What is our common ground? This world is our common ground, our world. It's not about Aboriginal country. Aboriginal country is our country, our world. Let's not forget that. Vicky's perspective again, her philosophy. It is our belief that the leadership of Australian Aboriginal cultural leaders will help us to live in productive and satisfying ways into the future. After all, we are the first people and we are the longest living unbroken culture in existence. Aboriginal people have survived through 2 ice ages. It is the values and ethics evident in Aboriginal philosophy and the knowledge base that this philosophy supports, the epistemology that guides the practice of living as a human being within the natural world, more than connected to the sacred, but operating from within the sacred connection to the earth. That gives us real hope. So I'm going to leave you with those words because Vicky will add to that, I'm sure. And she's going to also reflect on the direction of activism. Where to now? What can we do? So many of us are seeking answers, but the answers are already there.
Thank you so much, Olivia. My name is Victoria Grieve-Williams, and I'm really honoured to be here on what is actually, in my mind, the 4th Indigenous Knowledge Symposium that I've been a part of developing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I want to go back to the welcome by Ngawi, Auntie Carolyn Briggs. Her welcome was so gentle, so explicit, so fine, and it reminded me of what it means to me to be a Warraimaay person. The elders in Warraimaay country, and unfortunately, I think there's really only one elder to me left, but I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with those people, and they take a lot of pride in being non-violent and gentle, so that when there was a native title meeting, the first of our native title meetings in country, which was a bit of a sham, but I'm not going into that, at the end of the meeting, people said, "Oh, that was a good meeting, wasn't it? That was such a good meeting." And we all knew what they were saying. Nobody argued and fought. And that's how they like it to be. So the Warraimaay elders have talked a little bit disparagingly about surrounding groups who might be more disposed to violence than we are. And this is a very strong principle, if you like, amongst Warraimaay people, not to be aggressive, not to be violent. And I think it fits in generally with that Aboriginal philosophical idea that, you know, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and that is you don't always approach issues front-on aggressively. There are other ways of solving issues. And in this respect, I want to just raise the issue with you that the left and right of Western politics, I think in the end, eventually, it will come to pass that we will see more clearly they have very little to offer us. Walter Mignolo, who's a scholar of Indigenous people in Latin America, has said that the left and right of Western politics has very little to offer in comparison to that of Indigenous knowledge. So in other places around the world, you know, for example, in Ecuador, there is an Indigenous knowledge university, and people are now studying these things. The left and right of Western politics that some of us hold so dear in our day-to-day lives, to the point where we don't talk to people who are of the other persuasion, when really in Aboriginal contexts, it's always good to keep open lines of communication, even with the station boss, who is a hard taskmaster and, you know, has a kind of hegemony over people. Aboriginal people took pride in being able to keep open lines of communication. They had the agency. They made sure that happened in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I think this is one principle we need to really think about as Aboriginal people, keeping those lines of communication open. And so quite frankly, in the Australian situation, if I could establish an Aboriginal controlled and run university in Indigenous knowledge, I would deal with the devil himself to get it. We need to think about that. How can we get what we really need? Auntie Carolyn, in her talk, she reminded me of what it means to me to be an Aboriginal person. And I'm not one who's had to go around to various groups to find out if I might belong to them. I'm fortunate in some ways, but I went through a lot of unfortunate racism. I was born Aboriginal. I've always known it, even though people in my family may not have mentioned the word. And I knew it more by how other people in the communities we lived in treated me, how I was treated at school, and I came to understand through experience the impact of racism on my life. So my identity to me, because I have the genetics, whatever that means, I have an unbroken thread that takes me back to the ancestors. This is more of a responsibility than a right. It certainly played out in my life as a huge responsibility, where I've been, like Dennis Altman, a kind of reluctant activist in situations where nobody else is saying anything, and I think, oh, well, I suppose I'd better say it. I'm not a courageous person, not at all, and I've had to find ways of trying to be braver in situations that have been really extraordinarily intractable. What I want to say to you is the upside of all of that is the ancestors play a role in my life. And I feel like I'm put through tests and I have to prove myself in different ways. So sometimes I've found myself thinking, oh, why? Why me? Why do I have this task to do? But I want to say too that when I walk on my country, I'm aware that I'm walking on my ancestors. When I went back to live in my country, it was 15,000 years of generations before me. So when Native people say, when you walk on your country, you're walking on your ancestors, I actually felt that. And I think that's really like when they grabbed me and got me to do these things. And I want to say too, I know when I talk about this or when Aboriginal people talk about our connection to this country, it can also be like felt as a bit of a hurt and a bruising to non-Aboriginal people who feel a sense of belonging as well and who want to be a part. And what I want to say to you is it's okay to be non-Aboriginal. The philosophy of Aboriginal people is there for all people who live here. But it's a problem when you lie. And I understand that some people don't want to identify with the aggressive, colonial, violent, criminal occupation of our lands. It's not easy, I think, for white people to know that that is their legacy and their inheritance. But you can make that okay. A lot of you here in this room now are friends with Aboriginal people, I know that. And you follow things Aboriginal, like our struggle and our knowledges, with great interest. And I'm sure people embrace you. This is what we do. And please, understand that it's quite okay to be allies, and we value you for what you do. And the allies are not new. I'm descended from a man who was, and I want to honour him, my white ancestor, William Mcclement, who came from parents who were gentry but who chose to live with his wife and with her extended family. And for that, he was ostracised. For that, the family was totally disinherited. For that, his marriage to Annie Butler was written up in the local hysterical society, I like to call them, as, you know, some kind of transaction for her for bullocks and things like that, that she was ugly and that he would never have married her if there were white women around. 2009, I finally got a photograph of her. This photograph dates from the 1860s. I think there are very few photographs from Australia in the 1860s, but William had his own camera in those days, and it's like a family photograph of her with two of the children. She's extraordinarily beautiful, Aboriginal woman. And the local community there had a huge resentment towards William Mcclement and his family. It's another story. I've documented some of that, and some people may be aware of it. So, after speaking about the wonderful welcome by Auntie Carolyn, I want to say a little bit about what it's like to work with Olivia. If I'm talking about allies and collaborations. Olivia, to me, is like easy. It's like you don't have to explain a lot of things. You don't have to, like, she gets it straight away. And I've thought, well, maybe it's because Olivia too is an Indigenous person from Malaysia. That could be the reason. I know Olivia has had very strong and important relationships with Aboriginal people in Victoria since she's worked here. I don't know what the explanation is, but she's a very special person. And I can't praise her enough, and I can't say how honoured I am to have the opportunity to work with her. The point at which she says we met was when I had the opportunity to review an article for the journal out of Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Alternative. And I was so thrilled with this article that I told them they could give my name to the person who wrote it, and it was Olivia. And because I'd actually been in touch with her, I thought, oh, well, that figures. But Olivia doesn't remember the before. Never mind, it'll happen. And so then, you know, having the opportunity, we haven't actually spent a lot of time in each other's company, but we've done a lot of communicating over the internet and so on, and over the phone. And I'm really hoping that this collaboration can continue. It's very rich and it's very powerful in my life, and I'm very happy with it. This conference has exceeded our expectations. I've felt a little bit overwhelmed when I'm trying to look at how I can possibly do justice to all of you who've given papers and keynotes here. It's a bigger task than I can do. I think we're going to have some, you know, outcomes of this conference going on into the future. And I thought when I looked at the program and thought, oh, do we have to have concurrent sessions? And we did, because, you know, every concurrent session I wanted to be somewhere I couldn't be. And so I look forward to the written papers that are going to be coming up out of this, hopefully. I want to continue discussions with many people. For example, Rebecca Hill and her take on Manus prison theory, because I'm also doing some work in that area. I want to continue a dialogue with Laurie Hansen from Saskatchewan, who's a long-time scholar of activism, and the short conversation we had, she was able to fill me in on some of the background. And certainly her work in Nicaragua looks very interesting to me. We need more. It was Laurie who told me that she came here from Canada because there just aren't that many conferences on activism. Now, doesn't that surprise you? I mean, I think we need so much more. We need to be in dialogue about activism all over the world, increasingly as we move into the Anthropocene. I've used Patricia Hill-Collins' schema for the kinds of activism, the strategic possibilities for activism, and I've started to look at how the presentations in this conference fitted into this schema. That is, I was going to use the slide that Patricia had, but I've got a real problem with my laptop at the moment, and that wasn't possible. But I'm going to talk to you about it, and hopefully you'll have a mind picture. Cultural politics, survival politics, institutional politics, and protest politics. The cultural politics, the presentations in this conference were quite huge, and of course far too many for me to mention each one. But there were papers about art, and more art, and I was particularly disappointed to miss Ria's session. Her work drawing on a legacy of ongoing colonial trauma, grief and loss. But through art, Ria works this out. She says it's exhausting, but this is really necessary work, and for which we are all grateful, and it's so wonderful to see her work in the major collecting institutions in this country. Bonnie Cassidy, her paper, How Non-Aboriginal Poets Can Be Allies of Aboriginal People, looks very fascinating. Gretchen Coombs' work on mapping the aesthetics of disruption. Deborah Eddy engaged in pushing back on ageism through craft projects. In the survival politics section, I would especially mention Pauline Anastasiou and her quiet activism for social change, whereby volunteers provide meals to build community and a sense of belonging, just here in Federation Square. This is the way she presented it was very beautiful. I did catch that session, and it seems like something that can be done more often, more regularly, in more parts of the world. And she talked a lot about the satisfaction that people get from being involved in that work as volunteers. There's a two-way wellbeing opportunity there. Lauren Guerreri and her paper about fat activism against the hegemonic gendered order. Juan Garrido Salvado's story of survival as an activist within the Chilean Pinochet regime. Julie Peters and her idea of slow activism, the personal critical autoethnography, and as Royoko Rose demonstrates, it's important just to keep going. Institutional activism, I was particularly interested in those people who are talking about stretching the institutions, challenging them, disrupting them. I don't know, most institutions are repressive, in my experience, including the institution of history in Australia. I'm a historian. I'm an Aboriginal historian. Believe me, the institution of history needs a good shake-up, not to mention universities. I was very interested in the idea of archive and how the archive as an institution needs to be stretched to accommodate the work of activists. And Catherine Jarvie's paper on the idea of a global archive of animal rights activism was particularly relevant to this. Georgina Birch was introducing ways of retaining African youth in education institutions here in Melbourne. Extremely important work, and she has a conference of African youth happening here in 2020. I've got a note here in the margin that I've just caught up with. The idea of an archive for animal rights activism also gave me the idea of an archive for activism altogether. I don't think we have one, but I'm a historian. Archives are important to me, and that's what I thought might be a really important development. Antonio Castillo informs us of the perils of journalism in Latin America. Journalism and media as institutions, of course, social media is in the hands of the individual people and activism, but we still have the mainstream media in all parts of the world that is definitely problematic when it comes to, retaining the existing social orders and acting against social and political change. We had some beautiful presentations about protest as well. I liked Ben Lado's idea of organising to produce art as protest. Tracy Carpenter talking about water rights struggle in New South Wales. And the Freedom Flotilla blockade of Gaza. I want to talk too about that James Godfrey was active, or I think gave that paper, or he's involved in the Freedom Flotilla. But James is also working to let us know how students and staff in universities in the UK are resisting measures to silence them through accusations of promoting terrorism. That is, students and staff involved in the BDS movement. I want to mention too Susie Hutchings' paper about decolonising the university, decolonising the academy. This is really important work that people in this room as academics, I'm sure, are very aware of. The Reoccupations Collective in Newcastle, I really want to know who they are. There were no names there, and I missed that session. But wow, what an interesting initiative they've got there. And also the women of colour in academia. That is Lutfia, Kelly, Kashifa, Chirika and Sarah. That looked like an amazing session that I missed. So many of these papers bridge the gaps where cultural politics become protests, survival politics are necessary in activism within institutions, and survival politics also are necessary in protest politics and so on. I was particularly interested to hear Dennis Altman talk about being the accidental activist who's worked in sexual and AIDS politics, where he says there's a lot of science. He had to struggle once to get a session to do with literature, AIDS and literature, and it had to be off or outside of the conference. And he said it turned out to be the best session of the whole conference. He says the importance of art and culture, especially literature, cannot be underestimated. The personal, emotive, affective is so important in dealing with the authoritarian, masculine hegemony that exists across the world. So after immersing myself in thinking about how the papers fit into Patricia's idea of the nature of protests, I came back to what was actually in my abstract and what I really want to say. I'm also taking Patricia's very good advice that she said, say what you really want to say and then get out. So I'm going to say what I really want to say today, because this could very well be my swan song. I did consider telling you my age, but I'm not going to. My career began 40 years ago in 1980 when I was the first Aboriginal graduate with first-class honours, and I did a double major in history at the University of New South Wales. And in those days, as an undergraduate, I was one of 4 Aboriginal students on campus, and this was the days before there was any support at all. And it was the days when we didn't have computers, but I had a little portable typewriter. And it's so hard to correct your mistakes when you've got one of those. That's so long ago. And so Helen Corbett from WA was an undergraduate with me, and Helen and I became very good friends. Lorraine Little from Alice Springs, who became an Aboriginal lawyer, and a woman called Lynn Holton from Port Macquarie, who was studying law, but I don't think she finished her degree. I lost track of her. And from that graduation in 1980, I was recruited to work in the Aboriginal Resources. It was called the Aboriginal Resources Centre in Redfern, and a woman from Western Australia called Rosemary Stack recruited me. Rosemary went on to University of Sydney to work on the program with Aboriginal education workers there. And, you know, I was invited to write a piece, an ego histoire piece once, and I became aware that French historian, a theorist called Pierre Nora, believes that when you read history, you're learning more about the person who wrote that history than the history itself. And so he has this idea that if we write about ourselves, we're actually writing about our relationship with history, which is what Dennis Altman is going to go on to do, which is good news for all of us. I've written an ego histoire piece, a chapter in a book called Napaji Napaji. I think that is All Things in Turn, I'm not sure, but a while after it was published, I realised that I just talked about all the good things. This is what I generally do. If I'm telling people the story of my life, I just tend to concentrate on the good things. I resile from talking about the bad things. I think most of us do that. But what happened to me, I'm talking about the good part now, was that somehow I got introduced to Aboriginal philosophy. And from working at the Aboriginal Resources Centre in Redfern, where we were working with teachers to bring things Aboriginal into the classroom, before there was ever an Aboriginal education policy, and the work we did there sort of did contribute to that, I went to work at Tranby Aboriginal College. In fact, Helen Corbett, who'd become the Director of Studies there, recruited me to be a head teacher. So here I was, a new graduate. I think by then I'd got my diploma of teaching. There was an idea I should go back to my home community to teach in the high school. And gosh, I'm glad I didn't do that. But Tranby picked me up as a head teacher, and that was where I really cut my teeth as an Aboriginal person. Now, I developed, with others, I developed curriculum in Aboriginal studies. This was some of the first curriculum to be produced in Australia. It went on to TAFE and to universities. But what happened there, and I really don't know why, I invited Gary Foley to give us a guest lecture on Aboriginal philosophy. And I was absolutely in awe. Gary stood with no notes, talked for an hour, and we were all blown away. So much so that one of the students in that year went on to develop the Aboriginal Philosophy Farm, which was at Warraimaay, if anybody remembers that, Jack Beatson. I think some of the cultural leaders who are here may have gone there at some time, where there were meetings to talk about Aboriginal philosophy quite often. However, that faded out. I've come to understand Aboriginal philosophy is not just a theory, but it's praxis. It is the way that we can create and meet the future. We can create our own future through following the theoretical parameters of Aboriginal philosophy. From Tranby, I went to Canberra and I worked on the National Aboriginal Education Policy. And I met a lot of people around the country in the course of that enriched my knowledge of what it means to be an Aboriginal person. And I began my PhD in the early 90s at ANU, and I finally graduated at Macquarie, in 2010. This is like, how many Aboriginal people do you know who've done that? I think this is like the Aboriginal journey. 2 or 3 different universities, 4 children or so later, and there I am, finally with the PhD. From 1995 to 2003, I was living on my own country. And I went to the University of Newcastle to work in 2001. There I met a man by the name of Fred Marr. And Fred was working in Wallatuka, but he was very keen to do a master's degree on what he called Aboriginal Spirituality. And we had conversations, I remember Tranby days and all that, like we used to talk about our spirituality like it was a known, we all knew what it was, we just didn't have the words. The spirituality then was kind of more like a feeling, an understanding, an intangible value. And Fred wanted to map that for his master's. Fred didn't go on to do that, unfortunately, but he sowed the seed with me. And so I do want to mention him in terms of the work that I've produced. He was a very important catalyst for that. And so from there, I ended up publishing that paper that Olivia, or the book that Olivia referenced, Aboriginal Philosophy and the Social and Emotional Wellbeing of Aboriginal People. I did that when I was working as a consultant and I had to support myself to finish my PhD. It was published in about 2008 or 2007, I think. And, you know, it was highly contested work. Actually, Jim Everett, who's here, of course, was part of the reference group that I developed to help me with that. Jim has been a very important intellectual to assist me on this journey with Aboriginal philosophy. And another bit of consultancy work I got was to explore the relationship between Indigenous wellbeing and Aboriginal cultural heritage. And what I did as part of that was to develop a reference group in Redfern of 22, 23 Aboriginal people, about 1/3 of them men and 2/3 women, all ages, coming from a lot of different parts of the country, but resident in Redfern. And they informed me of the factors that influenced their wellbeing. And interestingly, all of these factors were Aboriginal philosophy factors, Aboriginal cultural factors. So number 1 was spirituality. And they defined it as a group in this way. Spirituality is a feeling with a base in connectedness to the past, ancestors and the values that they represent. For example, respect for elders, a moral, ethical path. It is about being in an Aboriginal cultural space, experiencing community and connectedness with land and nature, including proper nutrition and shelter. Feeling good about oneself, proud of being an Aboriginal person. It is a state of being that includes knowledge, calmness, acceptance and tolerance, balance and focus, inner strength, cleansing and inner peace, feeling whole, an understanding of cultural roots and deep well-being. Number 2, they said, was knowing about my people's history and culture. This was the second important factor to impact on their well-being. Knowing about your people's history and culture enhances identity, gives strength and pride, a sense of belonging. It gives more grounding in life, a connection to the knowledge of ancestors and cultural activity, including language, art, law, and dance. It allows a way of sharing, connection to land, survival, bush tucker, and medicines. It also allows empowerment for a person to move on in life in a positive way. It increases all aspects of one's well-being as it enhances their life in every way: physical, emotional, spiritual, economic, body, mind, and spirit. So out of this research I did with those people in Redfern, I realised what was missing. It wasn't just that. I had a cousin working in the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage area of New South Wales Government, and I became aware of a group of 600 Aboriginal people, that department being the largest single employer of Aboriginal people. And at their meeting, they were quite powerful in the department at that time, and at their meeting they had said they wanted education and training in Aboriginal culture. And they said, we go into jobs where people expect us to know everything just because we're Aboriginal. We don't know everything. There's a whole lot more we want to know. And so this gave me the idea that what was really needed was cultural heritage education programs for Aboriginal people, including Aboriginal language studies. And I could see that they were likely to produce a new wave of Aboriginal innovation and change, just as that occurred within the arts, dance, photography and art during the 1970s and 80s. However, more than this, since cultural heritage is so closely interlinked with wellbeing, the outcome of such programs are likely to have positive impacts on all areas of Aboriginal life and interaction with the broader community. I got very excited about that. And out of that came the idea of the Bachelor of Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Management. At a point in negotiation with the University of Sydney, I reduced that to the idea of a master's for people who already had degrees and who were working in the area of Aboriginal cultural heritage management and who could do with like more of a professional education in that area. But what happened was that the university rejected this. They were expecting a new senior appointment and they said, we'll wait till that person comes, that person's appointed, and then we will look to see if they agree or they don't. Well, I don't know if anybody's read my article, my blog on the Acrosa blog, but that was what happened. I called it the scorched earth of Aboriginal programs on campus. And the whole idea of this bachelor went out the window. The whole idea of this program just melted into nothingness. I thought today, I want to mention that. I want to mention to you that this is the kind of program we need in universities. There's no actual professional development program for Aboriginal people in their own cultural heritage. No thoroughgoing program at the moment. This is actually a part of decolonising. It would be an important part of decolonising the university, which of course most universities don't want. But after this, you know, so after all the work I did and everything else came to nothing, even starting to develop curriculum, there were about 12 academics within the university who were willing to work with us in the teaching programs, so on and so forth. You know, University of Sydney appointed a person who'd never worked in a university before. And somebody said to me, don't think it's by accident, Vicky. Don't think that's by accident. They actually don't want the kind of thing that you're proposing. I don't know, the jury's out, but it didn't happen. And then I met people who are activists in universities in the UK who are saying that the university is not a place that you go to for an education anymore. The university's become a corporate entity that's driving its staff and students like, nobody's business, and that they are working on developing community-based education programs. And certainly this is happening in Brazil, in Chiapas and other parts of the world. So we started to talk about an Aboriginal university. Now, what I've neglected to tell you when I mentioned Tranby is that Lynette Riley and I had the bright idea, the epiphany. How about Tranby becomes the first Aboriginal university? We were talking about that in 1985. Nobody is talking about an Aboriginal university in Australia now. Do you hear it? I don't hear it. I didn't even give a paper on it. But Susie Hutchings did give a paper on decolonising the academy, and I think we need to start working with that. In terms of maybe, looking at decolonising the academy by developing an Aboriginal university. The other area that I wanted to talk to you about, I'm coming to a close here, is activism that's directed at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander relationship to the nation state. This is for everyone. This is not just for Aboriginal people, not just our business, really, because, as I said to you before, I understand there are a lot of non-Aboriginal people who are very concerned about being the beneficiaries of a criminally occupied state. And, of course, Tula and George, yes, you know the names, Vasikopoulos and something or other, Kopoulos. Forgive me, I should have written them down. They've written that wonderful manifesto for being a white occupier. I forget the title exactly. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. I drew on their work in looking at the way in which the relationship to the nation state needs to change. Can I say to you, the Northern Territory intervention, I'm an Aboriginal person living in the south of Australia, and it almost gave me a nervous breakdown. We were so distraught. I was so distraught that any government could possibly do that to Aboriginal people. I was left thinking, why? And then I started to think, well, why do all these programs? I worked on them myself as a Commonwealth Public Service. Why do they fail? The government's talking about all these billions of dollars we put into Aboriginal affairs, and of course, nothing gets any better. And I'm thinking, well, you're actually reproducing things that have been tried before, and you're also getting rid of programs that work as soon as you see they're working. I mean, that's a little bit of a cynical, exaggerated view, but there is some truth in it. But what happened was I got invited to a conference in Germany about the intervention. Two scholars in Germany, in Bonn, had a wonderful conference about the intervention. I don't think there was one in Australia, not one. And as it happened, I was the only Aboriginal person who went to it. They had a whole raft of graduate students doing work on the Northern Territory intervention. My heart, it was fabulous to be there. But what had happened to me by then in my thinking was that I was introduced to the scholarship of Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, and his idea of the state of exception, the idea of homo sacer, that people who live in a state of exception have only bare life, non-material, right, bare life, very little food, living day to day, if not hour to hour. This, to me, explained Aboriginal Australia. And Agamben's idea of the state of exception, that is, no modern democracy can exist without a state of exception. Their very existence is predicated on putting someone else out, right? This is how they define themselves. So it occurred to me, terra nullius, okay, that became the first pillar of Aboriginal exception to the Australian state. In a chapter that I contributed to that book that came out of Germany on the intervention, and I discovered 7 pillars of Aboriginal exception to the Australian state. We live in a state of exception. This explains the continuing disadvantage of Aboriginal people. It explains why we are not citizens. One of the pillars being the cunning of citizenship. And in fact, the federal court ruling reported in the media this morning, whereby there are now 3 categories, alien, citizen and Indigenous, actually reinforces the idea of a state of exception. And while it was reported in the media that this is an opportunity to give unfair advantage to Indigenous people, it actually underlines the fact that we are in a state of exception and we do not have citizenship rights. They're concerned, according to the report I read, that this is an exception, acceptance by the judges of Aboriginal sovereignty. How about that? That the idea of our sovereignty exists in the minds of the people in the High Court. Just keep it there. Just keep it there. It's the truth. And it needs to be dealt with. So we live in a state of exception to the Australian state. And what I'm going to, in talking about what direction activism, I think probably the most important thing that we consider now is how to reconstitute the Australian state. Because Agamben says that the only way that you can deal with the difficulties of people in the state of exception, well, let me tell you, people in the state of exception are generally in camps. Camps are where people go to die. This explains the high death rate, explains the poor health, explains the lack of nutrition. It explains how all those other mechanisms that are there to keep citizens living in close proximity to Aboriginal people okay do not work for Aboriginal people. It's the state of exception. Right, so what he says is the only way you can deal with the injustice of having people in a state of exception is to reconstitute the state. So the human rights of people in the state of exception are in the centre of the new constitution. We've got a problem with the constitution in Australia that's not going to be solved by a preamble. It's not going to be solved by a voice to Parliament. And I don't believe it's going to be solved by treaties either. It's going to become cumbersome and a pain in the arse, frankly, this treaty business. And don't forget that at every turn you're going to be dealing with people who want to do the swift legal job on you, inserting clauses. Look what they did to native title. So what I'm suggesting, the way forward, is to really consider a new sovereign republic. There is a Republican movement. I've tried to talk to them. I've offered to give workshops. I don't get responses. I don't get responses from people in the Republican movement. They're not interested in a new republic at this point. They're not interested in a new republic that has Aboriginal sovereignty at the centre of it. But they can be. Keep on keeping on, keep on going. Let's work it. Let's bring it to their attention that the sovereignty of Indigenous people of this country exists. It is a truth. Anything else you want to talk about is criminal occupation. So let's get it out there and let's work together to create this new republic. Just in closing, what will Indigenous sovereignty mean for a new republic? We've got some idea from the cultural leaders who've spoken here today. Willie Brem speaks of love, the importance of love in everything you do. Wanta speaks of Indigenous knowledge as a gift. Adrian Barragubba says it is now time to stand our ground. Cato gives us a call to action. And that call to action is for all of us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and as allies and fellow travellers and great friends and collaborators. Create art, tell stories, inspire and be inspired. Follow the money trail. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, Cato. Follow the money trail. Sounds like a good idea.
It's about
The truth.
money doesn't lie.
Oh, right. Money tells you what the real plays are?
Yeah.
Okay. Connect with spirit. We all have it. Sits in here. Nunkari will tell you. Got to look after that one. Make sure you're full and you're whole. And feed this stomach as well as that one. As Wanta says. Defend country. Now more than ever. This is the imperative. Support and connect with custodians. It's not hard. It's really not hard. A lot of you know that already. And protect your wealth. Means you've got to think about what your wealth truly is. I would say in closing, keep those you love close to you and work on peace. Thank you so much. Do we have time, Olivia, for what we discussed? The idea that people might like to make a short statement about the conference? What do you think? Yes? Okay. So what we're interested to hear from, maybe 3 or 4 or 5, if you can keep your statement short, we'll hear from more people. But just informal feedback now about this conference and what people are taking away with them. And if you've got an inspirational idea to share with us, that'd be wonderful too. So is there anyone who would like to speak?
I've got the microphone. I'm cheating a little bit on this one, Vicky. I just wanted to finish off a chapter I didn't. The Tasmanian Aboriginal community, the Pakana...
Can't hear you.
The Tasmanian Aboriginal community, the Pakana and Palawa, achieved what we set out to do in 1972. We were acknowledged as a living Aboriginal community in 1995, and a package of 12 areas of land were returned to us. We've now had 17 in total areas of land returned to us, including Cape Barren Island. So I just wanted to finish with that. And thank you. I think that I'm like you. I missed out on some papers, and like Willie and Paul, the travel and talking late at night made us very tired in the morning. But thank you all the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Mine's more of a request than a question, I suppose, which is that if you don't want to voice things now necessarily, you can put them down in words on the banner, the collaborative banner in the salon on level 2. But obviously, if you've got anything to ask it.
Mm-hmm.
Or Twitter.
Or Twitter. And Twitter.
Hi, Vicky. Cato again. I think in the spirit of replying to what you're requesting, this whole event, I think it's been a great festival of ideas and a great opportunity for many of us to get together to meet, catch up, share ideas, learn from each other. And so I, for one, am inspired and going away with a number of different ideas. Sadly, of course, not being able to attend every session and all the amazing contributions that everyone has made. So, yeah, that's just my observation. I think this intersect between academia and people on the ground and the grassroots is critical, is important. I wonder, just on some of the stuff that you're talking about the future of universities and their role as public institutions in the actions of piracy that have come before us, and the way in which, with corporatisation, how universities are treating everyone as chattel. So that I think there are those challenges, and I've always been a grassroots community-based researcher and feel that's really important. You know, you're not acknowledged as one of the ivory tower, but I don't really want to be in an ivory tower. And finally, that's the big call to action. Treaties, constitutional debates, all of that is meaningless without discussion of the Australian Republic. And I don't think the Australian Republican movement are up to the challenge. You see who their past leadership are, is a former Prime Minister who couldn't, let's be crass, couldn't get it up when he was in Parliament. And that may be one of the things that we could go away and work on, you know, take these festival of ideas and the guy from Pakistan, I can't remember his name, but sitting in, listening to his, not Pakistan, Bangladesh, sorry. We are the people, and it's incumbent on us to actually take that action to bring about the future and the future of humanity that we aspire to. And I think that's the challenge. So going back and taking those actions, identifying where we want to go to, picking up on what Jim says, they started out with a goal, they've achieved that. And I think many of us are at that phase. I mean, I'm re-emerging in some areas on a national level because I have achieved what I went back home to achieve. And now's the time to start looking at what is the next goal. So I think, you know, generally in response to everyone else who have participated and made contributions, and in a reply to your challenge to us, that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Cato. Adrian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vicky, and Olivia, and everybody, all the participants, and all of the audience. And I believe that we'll go away enlightened by some of the things that we've learned. I'm sort of not accustomed to kind of events like this, where have a lot of intellectual people and, academics. Just the grassroots Murray, you know what I mean? On the street fighting for our rights.
You'll do me.
Trying to keep our mob out of jail.
You're okay.
Trying to find ways of stopping coppers from kicking out people in the guts. But it comes around to we have to stick with our family, And I've always heard that saying about, it's lonely out the front. And nobody wants to be out the front. A lot of them think they can do it. But it's lonely at the front. And the thing that we've found from the Wangajagalingu Family Council is that we bang this argument to the highest level in this country. We rattle everybody's cages. We did as much as we could. And even though the Murdoch media was so hell-bent in ostracising us and demonising us and saying that we're patsies, we still stand strong. And I've received so much here from leaders that I consider real leaders in the struggle that we've been struggling in this country. And I'm inspired by them. I'm inspired that we can connect with one another. We don't have to explain it, because when I hear them speak, I know I'm in the right place. And this was the right place for me to come. And I'm glad you invited me. And I can take things back to my people now and say that we do have friends and we have a lot of supporters. And thank you for supporting us. Thank you.
I just want to, well, it's on way too much. I just want to thank especially the cultural leaders and the organisers for putting the amazing group of people together between the keynotes and the cultural leaders. Every single time someone spoke, I felt like I was really taking it to my face, a real test to my subjective position that no matter how much I thought I knew coming in, no, my ignorance was still so... was the primary thing I need to keep working on, and it's really stimulated my creative mind for how to be a good ally, where that might start, and I came into this conference having sort of abandoned academia for protest and activism, and I came into this conference sort of with the opportunity to these things can be sort of married again. And I came in with my own idea that we risk the better activist, to be a good activist is to be willing to risk, and maybe to not have it as an option to not risk as well. So the ideas that I came in with about laying things on the line and being consistent and just being there in solidarity and always asking and checking, is your solidarity, is it good enough? Are you on the right track? That everything I came in with being built upon and doubled and tripled and quadrupled by especially the cultural leaders. Thank you so much, and to the organisers for putting us all together. Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to say very big thank you, especially to Vicky and Olivia, for putting this together. And just something that has been in my mind a lot is coming to the end of this conference, hoping that this isn't the end of these conversations or this way of coming together and speaking. It's just feels very important to me at this place we are at in our world that we are continuing these kind of conversations. So I really hope that, this has been an amazing conference, but, that perhaps in a year or 2 years or whatever, we can do this again, because I think that, these spaces are incredibly powerful points of resistance and change. One thing that I would hope, if that's the case and this was to continue, would be for the doors to be wider for more people to access this kind of knowledge. because I think that it's incredibly important, and I feel very privileged to have come here and shared this with everyone. And every speech that I heard has moved me incredibly. But I think a thread that I've seen a lot is where institutions' place is in this, and I think that radical change comes when we start to break down that and let more people into these conversations. So in moving forward, I would hope that there's more room for more people to come into this space. I think it is so needed for everyone who's engaged in all of these struggles. Thank you.
Hi, I'm up the back here. Thank you very much, Vicky and Olivia and everyone else who's worked with you for bringing this together, and to all the speakers. I heard as many papers as I could, and they were echoing what everyone else has said. They were very moving and inspiring in different ways. I have come here from the Northern Territory. I live and work in Mbantua, Alice Springs. There's a very, very, very big issue amongst many facing the Northern Territory right now, and that's the commencement of fracking. 97% of the Northern Territory has fracking exploration licences across it, and last year 51% of the Northern Territory was identified as fracking no-go zones. That means that 49% of the Northern Territory is open for fracking. It commenced this wet season. It's a big struggle on people's shoulders in the Northern Territory. People live far away. It's hard for people to travel to these kinds of events. There's an excellent film being made with people affected by fracking and the laying of pipelines across the Territory, which is going to be touring Australia this year through informal art and activist circles called Infractions. I encourage everybody to see it. If you'd like to organise a screening of it, come and talk to me. It's made by Australian writer, cultural critic, filmmaker, artist Rachel O'Reilly, who is based in Europe. As you noted, Vicky, a lot of the good work is being done elsewhere. Also encourage you to read her writing. Her take on the political economy, history of Australia and extractivism is excellent. But it's a big issue in the Northern Territory, and if there are going to be convergences like this again, really encourage people to consider inviting people from the anti-fracking struggle. SEED are doing an excellent job in the Northern Territory, but they're small. So if you can support SEED, and I've heard other people mention SEED at this event, please do so, Indigenous young people on the front lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say that hopefully there will be more events like this, but in the meantime, you might be of use in some of the struggles. I don't know. I hope you stay in touch with people like Adrian. He may need support in numbers. People like Paul and Linda, they may too. There are things that can be done. What I would urge is that you stay in touch, communicate, tweet, Facebook, whatever, to stay abreast of things as they're occurring, the different campaigns that we've heard from people here over the last 3 days. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.